Welcome to a new episode of Global Jewish Perspectives. I'm Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, and I'm very excited who I have on the show today, Stephen Smith. He is the emeritus director of the USC Shoah Foundation, and currently he's the co-founder and CEO of Storyfile. And if you don't know what Storyfile is, you will learn later in the program. But first, what I want to talk to him about, particularly now at this time after October 7th, is what I heard him speak about yesterday in a webinar. And that is, what is genocide? It's his specialty. Unfortunately, the world has to have such specialists in genocide, so let's learn from one. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Phyllis, for having me today. Yeah, genocide was responsible. Well, the crime of genocide took about 200 million lives in the 20th century, beginning as early as the first decade of the 20th century with the genocide of the Herero, then the Armenians. And so it went on decade after decade. And of course, we're all very familiar with the genocide of the Jews during World War II under the Germans. We call it the Holocaust. The crime of genocide is a crime stated in international law. It was 1948, in fact, in the wake of the Holocaust, that the United Nations created the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Now, it's really important, particularly at this time when we're hearing a lot of rhetoric about who is committing genocide, that we separate ourselves from those opinions and that rhetoric, because that's all it is. In fact, only a court of law with jurisdiction can define a genocide. Just like, for example, a homicide that takes place in a regular city on a regular day. The individuals in that town know at that time that somebody has died. It's a court of law that ultimately determines whether that was manslaughter, first or second degree murder, and that is, a jury that will decide that based on the facts. The same is true with the crime of genocide. It's a crime in international law. And while we might have a view about what is happening in the world today, only at that time will it be defined. Now, that doesn't help us in the same way as crime in our streets. It doesn't help us if we simply say, well, we don't know what it is and we don't care. We do care. And so essentially what we do, we look at situations through a specific lens. And as a genocide scholar, I would look at the situation that's happening in Israel, Gaza today through the lens of understanding that particular crime and those associated to it. What people don't realize very often is that the International Criminal Court, which was first actually put together through the Rome Statute in the 1990s, that was where the terms of the International Criminal Court were put together, has 4 crimes. It has war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression, and genocide. Now, these are committed by state actors or entities that are similar to state actors against a particular group of people. That could be that in a war crime, that the Geneva Conventions are broken and some crime is committed in the act of war that may or may not affect civilians, but it will very likely affect civilians, or be held responsible for flagrantly abusing the Geneva Conventions. So look, we'll leave that for one moment. All to say, there is a framework for that. What concerns me as a genocide scholar when I hear individuals opining about this is genocide against, Gaza and not taking into account the facts, while at the same time, a smaller act in terms of the number of victims is like dismissed as if it's not relevant. We've got to actually just deconstruct that a little. Genocide is not about numbers. It's not, well, the number is higher, therefore it's more of a genocide. Genocide actually is about intent. The intent to destroy in whole or in part, so it doesn't have to be the whole population, and political, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And then there are different articles which include killing the group, but also can be removing children, per the hostages, for example. So on the 7th of October, Phyllis, when I first saw the clips coming out of Israel on that day, a couple of weeks ago now, I looked at that through the eyes of a genocide scholar, and I knew within seconds that we were looking at a genocide for many reasons. The first is when I first heard that there had been a breakout of, some kind of breakout from Gaza with bulldozers, I assumed I was going to see something like the first Intifada with a group of teenagers with rocks, running through the fence. And as soon as we saw the images, what we saw was trained military personnel in fatigues carrying automatic weapons. So first of all, that tells you that the type of attack was not a civil uprising. There was military command. And secondly, what we saw was that there was training and that there was clear determination of what the targets were, more importantly, who the targets were, and that they were civilians living who were completely unarmed and completely unable to defend themselves in the situation. What you also see, which I noticed straight away, was body language. If you look at the body language of the killers of genocide across many genocide, there's a certain control and a certain nonchalance, taking your time because you know that you're in control and that your victims are completely helpless. It's how the Nazis worked. It's how the Interahamwe in Rwanda worked. And I looked at those images and immediately recognized these individuals had come to kill. They were taking their time and they were going to do it methodically and they were going to do it painfully. All of that, and then taking the hostages, which is removing the population from where it was in the kibbutzim to Gaza, is also an act of genocide. There are at least 3 out of the 5 counts of genocide that were committed on that morning, on October the 7th. At the time, I heard the number 250 potential victims. The number doesn't matter. It could be 250, 2,500, 250,000. The point is, what was the intent? How was it carried out? And what was the result? And the result is not only the maiming and the torture of the individuals in the kibbutzim and their families and their immediate families, but the psychological trauma purposely inflicted on not only the rest of Israeli society, but purposefully on the rest of the Jewish world.
Let's talk about intent based on the Hamas charter also. That has to factor in, right, in the definition of...
Yeah, so the Hamas Charter, created in 1988, has, I think, 41 articles, 42 articles. It's heavy-duty reading, but it's worth reading sometime. You may not sleep after reading it, but
that's what I'm afraid of.
Listen, this has been in existence since 1988, and it's very clearly stated the existence of Hamas is for the reinstatement of the Palestinian state across what is currently, as they say, from the river to the sea. It only exists for that purpose. And therefore, all of its actions that it's taking are based on a underlying genocidal ideology that ultimately will remove Jews from the state of Israel. I think it's also really important here for those of us who are Jewish to disaggregate in our minds the state of Israel and Jewish people living in the state of Israel, because they are not the same thing. There are, citizens of Israel who are not Jewish. Yeah. And it's quite clear that the target is Jewish people living in the state of Israel. Okay, maybe that's 70% or 75% of the population, but it's not 100% of the population. And that also is what makes it genocidal. It's targeted at a group of people, of civilians. And the reason it's important to disaggregate the state from the people, although it is a Jewish state, what our job to do is, as an international community, there is a norm called the responsibility to protect. And that is an international law that's been around since the early 2000s. And what it does, it calls on the international community to protect civilians of a state, even if it's not their own state.
And where did this come from? Who's
yeah, it was called R2. It's known as R2P, the responsibility to protect. It's not an international law. It's a set of norms that came about actually following the Darfur crisis, Darfur genocide, in which there was a lot of discussion around who has the right to intervene in a sovereign state on behalf of the civilians within that state. And there was a lot of shirking of responsibility. We also saw that around Rwanda, and that was one of the case studies, which was, well, we can't really intervene because it's not our state. Therefore, the civilians are at the mercy of the genocidal dictatorship of that state, and then we have the ability just to stand and watch it. And so, in fact, what happened was, if you remember in Rwanda, the then Clinton administration refrained from calling it genocide because they thought they might have an obligation in a law to intervene if it was called genocide, hence why it was described as a civil war, because nobody wanted to get involved and they could shirk their responsibility. And thereafter, when a similar kind of thing happened in Darfur, eventually there was a process that said, okay, we have to create an understanding, even if it's not a legal obligation, that when a civilian population is under threat from its own government or is just under threat, period, that there is an international responsibility to protect those civilians. And so what we're seeing is that Hamas, for example, which is the governing body of is the political power of the governing body of Gaza, has a genocidal ideology at its core, and is not only not protecting the civilians of Israel, I believe is not protecting the civilians of Gaza either. And in fact, it's putting them in harm's way.
Yes.
Purposely. So it needs to be held accountable for this. I'll say one more thing about this, which is an interesting fact. So Israel and Palestine, as defined in 1948, both entities signed the Geneva Conventions at that time. Later, when the Rome Statute came into being, and the creation of the International Criminal Court, Palestine, which at the moment is the three entities of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, signed the International Criminal Court onto the International Criminal Court, probably because they wanted the protections of the International Criminal Court against what they think is a genocidal regime in Israel. But the truth is, as signatories to that statute and as members of that, they absolutely can be held accountable for the crime of genocide. And there is enough evidence on October the 7th, I believe, as a non-lawyer, I just have to say this, I believe that there will be investigations, and I think it will lead to prosecutions if any of those leaders are still around at the end of this, because they are signatories to the Rome Statute, and they committed in my non-legal perspective, as a more scholarly perspective, I believe that the crime of genocide was committed on October the 7th, and that ultimately somebody or somebodies will need to be held accountable for that.
I like to do every one of these episodes I've done recently to interject one thing here to remind people. In 2005, Israel completely withdrew from the Gaza Strip. My husband and I were on a mission. We were in Sderot when the Israeli soldiers came south and removed the Israeli settlers and totally took everyone out of Gaza and gave Gaza to the Gazians. So Israel has not occupied, quote unquote, Gaza since 2005. And then, of course, we all know in 2006 or 7, depending on what day the elections were, Hamas was voted in as the government of Gaza. And I always like to remind people of that. So when we talk about genocide and state entities, we are talking about the politically elected government of the Gaza Strip. So it's not like anyone can say, oh, we can't hold them accountable under these rules that you just said because it's a whatever. No, it's a government elected. Would you agree? Did I explain it well for a non
Absolutely. I think we've learned several times in history, be careful who you vote for. You know, the Germans voted for the Nazis in the 1930s and 32.
Right, 32.
They enabled that group of people to take power and then consolidate that power. Unfortunately, this is true in this case too. Hamas is in power because the Palestinians in Gaza, or the population of Gaza, which is almost entirely Palestinian, chose them as their leaders. And you just got to be aware who you who you make your leaders.
Yes. So let's go back in time, sort of. I would love you to tell people about Storyfile and how you and I missed meeting each other at the Eradicate Hate Summit in Pittsburgh at the end of September, but who was one of the guests there? Tell us what Storyfile is.
Yeah, so it all goes back to about 2010. My now wife, Heather, her name is Heather Mayer Smith, had done an interview that day. She also interviews Holocaust survivors like I. And I was the head of the Shoah Foundation, and she was a Holocaust testimony interviewer independently. And she was telling me that she'd interviewed a lady called Rose Schindler from San Diego. And that after they'd finished the interview, the two of them were sitting at the kitchen table having coffee, having a conversation. And she said, I just realized that my unborn grandchildren will never have the opportunity to converse with Rose. I want to capture that conversation. So she and the Shoah Foundation and an amazing lab at USC called the Institute of Creative Technologies worked together to create a technology that allowed us to interview about 12 at the time Holocaust survivors with holographic cameras and a big screen and to be able to create a conversation. And now those interviews are in museums all around the world, actually, where you can go and talk to a Holocaust survivor. The purpose was to make sure that the conversations we were having about our world were there for the future and their lives. While we were doing that, Phyllis, and we were taking it to the Simon Wiesenthal Center and Holocaust Museum LA, and we were putting these new interviews in front of the public, a number of people turned around and said, can I do this with my grandmother? Could I interview the founder of my company? Could we interview the person who led the civil rights movement here in LA? And we went, well, yeah, I guess, but it's a really expensive process and it's a university project. So that's when the idea of Storyfile came about. Why don't we try and create a technology that will allow everybody to tell their stories? Because just like all of us have an individual fingerprint and individual DNA, the other thing that we have is our own story, and it's our unique story. So we created Storyfile for that. On the one hand, we have a studio where we do very high fidelity holographic interviews. For example, we're launching on Veterans Day in the World War II Museum, a wonderful set of interviews with World War II veterans who are still alive, remarkable heroes of our nation, and so honored and proud to take their stories. And that's sort of for a museum, if you like. But then on the other side of this, we have a product called Storyfile Life, where basically anybody can tell their story by going online and signing up, and then grandchildren can sit and ask their grandparents questions, and then their children later on will be able to meet their great grandmother that they never met in real life and ask her questions, for example. But there's also a really important application. We also see that this technology can be used for social impact. We've interviewed freedom riders and the survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre and people who've been right at the forefront of the civil rights movement and have been a part of our country's battle, if you like, for its values and morals, and just amazing experiences. And one of them was recently we did a project with Meta, formerly Facebook, to create a Holocaust education program in virtual reality. When you put the goggles on and you're inside the space, with a wonderful Holocaust survivor. Her name is Inga Auerbacher. And there we go. I Am a Star. That's her book. And if you've not read it, well, obviously you have it, Phyllis. Yes. But if your viewers have not read I Am a Star, go get a copy. Oh, I have to tell you a little story. I was coming back from Germany with Inga. I arrive at the border. She was in a wheelchair because she's great but a little wobbly, so we got a wheelchair for her. And so when I got to the immigration officer, she couldn't see who I was with. I passed the two passports through. She looks at mine. She's very grumpy. She's obviously having a bad day. She passes it back to me. She opens the next one. Her eyes light up, and she stands up to look and see who's in the wheelchair. And she goes, "Miss Auerbacher, you are a star." And she said, "You came to my school, and I have, when I was a young person, and I have your book on my bedstand." Wow. And this lady's face lit up. And if ever I've seen a moment about why Holocaust education is so important, it was that moment. Because this woman had related to her story in a most profound way that would just lit her up in that moment. And so what we try to do with this is use the Storyfile technology and put it inside virtual reality. So now what you can do is you can go into the goggles and you can talk to Inga as if she's sitting right in front of you in 3D. And then as she tells her stories of being deported to the Terezin ghetto or Kristallnacht, the November pogrom, or the stories of her childhood, they all unfold around you in these beautiful illustrations for younger children, so that young children, sort of 10, 11, 12, 13, can understand the journey of a child of their age through the Holocaust period. And it's very nice to be able to use the technology in that way.
I was really excited when I learned about it because I have seen the technology at the Illinois Holocaust Museum in Skokie, both when you can ask questions, and also I was there recently and got a tour of the virtual reality of Auschwitz. So I know how effective it is, but this additional concept just kind of blew me away, because the more we can make it emotional for viewers, I know that it really resonates much better than any books or any, documentaries are wonderful, but unless they're emotional, people really don't feel it, and we want people to feel it.
That's right. They talk about VR being an empathy machine. I'm not sure it's exactly that, but what I think it does allow you to do is immerse yourself. And the thing that this is so good for is, just like we're having this conversation, we're face to face, we're talking, we're engaging with each other. I've emailed in the past, but it's not the same as you asking me questions and me answering, and we are engaging. In fact, from an educational point of view for this, there's research that says that when you ask a question of somebody and you listen to the answer, you have a 6 times higher level of retention of the information, because it's your curiosity that's driving the engagement, and therefore your receptors for receiving the information are fully open. They tested this with school kids in a classroom where the kids heard the question of a neighboring school child and heard the information. Their retention was 5 times lower.
That's fascinating. And yet, when you
Yeah,
think about it, it's logical, because when you ask the question, you're invested in the
right.
answer. And when you just hear the information, you're not necessarily invested in the information.
Right.
So,
And it's also that it's about exploration, right? So we learn most when we're discerning things from the environment around us, and when we are deciphering for ourselves. How we learn a language. How does a 2-year-old learn to learn, a language? They are deciphering through the curiosity of what those sounds mean in relation to things. So we're programmed to do this, but what happens is we get lazy when we when it's didactic. So the idea of this particular method is, it's not didactic. You've got to go and find it for yourself, and then make the exploration and the inquiry and the curiosity the learning piece of it. And of course, you're also talking to amazing people. Inga is just a remarkable human being, but we see so many of them. I had last week we had George Takei in our studio doing an interview, and of course he's got his Star Trek piece. But what a wonderful human being, who's fought for LGBTQ rights over his life. He was incarcerated as Japanese American as a child, and just
I didn't know
told,
that.
yeah, profound stories of this 10-year-old, 4 different camps he was in California. Vivid, actually, probably some of the most vivid memories I've heard. And we've interviewed probably 10 or a dozen internees at this point, because his mind was just so nascent. And then, they came out of the camps, and then they had nowhere to live. They lived on Skid Row downtown. They were homeless. And so this sort of very well known, celebrity who you might think is here, comes to us because of
Right.
celebrity, is coming to tell the story of the struggle of identity in America as a Japanese American gay man, and coming from nothing to then being able to be of great influence in our society. And just to get the chance to talk to him, just as we did in the studio, you will be able to do, and just learn everything that we learned from him.
It's wonderful. It's just, when technology is good, it's so very, very good. And we won't talk about when it's bad, when it's used to promote terrible things about others. We're only going to talk about when it's good.
Well, what I will say, one thing about that is technology is just a tool. So it's going to be whatever it's going to be based on who uses it. So if you have a problem with technology being bad, get in and use it for good. That's all I would say, because there's plenty of opportunities to get great messaging out, to use it in a way. There is one other overrider to this. We have become I think we've become dependent on technology for technology's sake.
Mm.
So we are a technology company, Storyfile. That's what we see ourselves as. But we're really interested in what's the story and how can we support the story with the technology that we have. And in that case, then we're not out there just selling bits and bytes, and we're actually, what we're doing is providing support for people to communicate better to each other and learn from one another. And I think if technology is in service of our human adventure and our human endeavor and learning, I think it's always going to be a good technology. But it's only that, it's just technology.
With that, we've come to the end of this wonderful talk. Unless there's something that you really want to say that we've missed that you think my listeners would be interested in.
Well, I want to say just one thing. Phyllis, I recently converted to Judaism.
Yes.
First of all, I just love this whole journey. I know that Jews are not supposed to proselytize, but if I had my way, I'd be out with a sandwich board proselytizing on the corner of my street here. Everybody should know, and everybody should experience what I've experienced, the warmth and the kindness. And I would say that a lot of the hatred that we receive is because we have what a lot of people crave: community, continuity, history, tradition, survival, identity in the world. And I would just say that when as a scholar of genocide, I have never been interested in it for morbid fascination. In fact, I really dislike what I do from that perspective. But what I gain from this is, and have gained a great deal of in the last few months as I've completed this journey, is understanding that while there are anti-Semites who are so vicious, so hateful, and so violent, that we do have each other. And there are 15 million of us. And when the chips are down, we might have 15 million versions of Jewish life and identity and religion. But when the chips are down, we are just one people. And Israel Chai is being born out of a lot of suffering. But boy, does it mean a great deal.
And with that, because at the time that I'm interviewing him, it's right before Shabbat here in Los Angeles, and Stephen's also in Los Angeles. So I'm going to end this by saying Shabbat Shalom, which is a greeting about Shabbat and peace. And may we all have peace. Thank you.